Edwin, Sarita, and Ben, thank you all so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. I taught in several of the jail facilities on Rikers Island with Manhattan College for 2 years while I was in rabbinical school. In my time there, I met so many talented, caring, and brilliant New Yorkers who were languishing on Rikers, some for several years away from family and friends, just waiting for their day in court. One of those people was named Carmen. At the end of one semester, I remember working with her on her final paper. She was writing about finding hope while behind the jail walls. She defined hope as the ability to see beyond where you are. The ability to see beyond where you are. Her definition has stuck with me for years. As Jews, we are called to hope, to see a better future for ourselves and our children. And often, especially biblically, it is the role of the prophet to name the mistakes we have made collectively and offer us a new way forward, a new vision for the way we live our lives. That is the work of hope in Jewish tradition. Biblically, that work begins with opening our eyes to what is broken in our communities. There is a beautiful story about Abraham, who is the first person to be called a prophet in our tradition, that is told by our sages, who want to know why God chooses Abraham to be the father of a new nation. Our sages imagine that Abraham was walking one day and saw a structure or building on fire. Many people, they teach, saw this fire burning, but Abraham was the only one who stopped in front of the flames and asked who owned the house. Abraham's prophetic journey begins when he recognizes what is on fire in his own backyard. I invite you today to hear the voices of our speakers as prophets of hope, people calling our attention to what is on fire in our own backyard and offering us new ways forward for safety, care, and justice in our city. I am honored now to introduce you to our first prophet of hope, Edwin Santana. Edwin is a Puerto Rican freedom fighter, a spoken word artist, a formerly incarcerated individual, and an advocate for criminal justice. Edwin has worked as a case manager for organizations such as Harlem United and the Institute of Justice and Opportunity. He spent many years as a campaign leader for the Close Rikers campaign at Just Leadership USA, and he's currently a member of the New York Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement, the Rikers Island Public Memory Project, and the Fortune Society. In April of 2021, Edwin founded Tough Art Media, a production company based in New York. And Edwin also joined us kind of at the last minute. So I'm so grateful that he was able to be here today to share his story. And thank you so much, Edwin. The Zoom is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm also a community organizer for Freedom Agenda. And I'm also a survivor of Rikers Island. So when you say there's a fire in our backyard, right, I'm here to tell you that that fire has been burning for a long time. I've experienced Rikers Island a couple of times in my lifetime. I'm 48 years old. Um, and I can tell you right now that the conditions that are plaguing Rikers Island right now, today in 2024, are the same issues that has been plaguing Rikers Island from since when I was a kid, you know, way before I even thought about even being on Rikers Island. And you know, it's like I said, that fire has been burning for a long time, and I'm just so glad that now it's such a big movement, right? Such a widespread movement that it's grabbing everybody's attention in the city and making sure that everybody's aware of this crisis. It's a human rights crisis. I spent my time there, and I can tell you that the violence from both sides of the fence, it's very dire. Violence, just straight up disrespect, inhumane treatment. And I'm just telling you from a man's point of view, because I was, I can't tell you how the females were treated there, but I'm pretty sure, because I've met many females that have done time on Rikers, that had experienced the same thing that I have experienced as a man. So, I'm just here to tell you that, Rikers Island is a human rights crisis that's been going on for years. And I'm just so glad that, not only individuals who have been directly impacted like myself are coming to the forefront and using their voice, as a weapon against or a reason to douse this fire that we brought up earlier, right? So there's a fire burning, we need to douse it, and this is what we're doing now. We're using our experiences, we're using our voices, and I'm so glad that religious organizations from every denomination is coming forth uh, and helping us with this issue. So I appreciate everybody being on this call. When you talk about closed Rikers, when you're dealing with decarceration here in New York City, just know that you're talking about me, right? You're talking about individuals like me who are living this, who are out here, who's trying to, do the best they can uh, uh, from the trauma that I have suffered from Rikers Island. I'm working through all that stuff, and it's people like you that wants to get involved, that really inspires me to keep doing what I'm doing. So I want to thank you all for inviting me here today, and I appreciate the call, and I appreciate y'all listening to me, and I appreciate y'all just listening to the individuals who's going to give the presentation, and why we need to close Rikers, and why we need to keep on track on the expiration date to close Rikers, and why we need to maintain our foot on the mayor's neck and the city council and things of that nature. So because it's we're on the line, and like I said, when you talk about these things and you bring up these issues, you're talking about me, specifically me. So I thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And I want to just pass it now to my coworker Sarita Daftary.
Thank you so much, Edwin. And really a pleasure to see lots of new faces here, as well as some old friends and familiar faces. So thank you so much for having us. I'm going to share my screen to pick up where Edwin led us to, talking about sort of where we are at with closing Rikers, how we got here, and what are some of the next steps. So I will take a minute to get my presentation set up. So Edwin and I are staff at Freedom Agenda. We are a member-led project organizing with people and communities who have been directly impacted by incarceration. And we are one of the organizations leading the campaign to close Rikers. So when we talk about closing Rikers, for us, it's not just closing the jails on Rikers. It is reducing incarceration. It certainly is closing the jails on Rikers, that's fundamental, but it's also reducing our over-reliance on incarceration. It's addressing conditions of confinement for a smaller number of people who are detained, and also the people who are incarcerated now. And it's also shifting resources from where we have been directing too much in terms of too much incarceration onto the resources that we need in our communities. There is a legal deadline to close Rikers, which is one of the reasons I wanted to share this photo. You see us with our 4-year countdown. So this was on August 31st, 2027. We are now less than 4 years from the legal deadline to close Rikers. And I'm going to share a bit about where this plan came from and the status of these efforts. And I will mention with gratitude that both Central Synagogue and the New York Jewish Coalition on Criminal Justice Reform are members among 170 organizations signed on to the campaign to close Rikers. So why close Rikers? There are many reasons, and we'll touch on a few. As you heard from Edwin as well, Rikers is undermining human rights and public safety, and we simply cannot be a safe and just city if we keep churning thousands of our most vulnerable neighbors through a penal colony that is designed to isolate and dehumanize them. It is also a facility that holds almost 90% people who are awaiting trial, who have not even been convicted yet. The size of Rikers enables that mass incarceration, and in this specific case, the mass detention of people who are not yet convicted. It's not just one jail, it is 10 jails on a 400-acre island, and much of that land is actually decomposing garbage. So the physical environment exposes people to environmental risks as well. And the isolation of Rikers is a burden for detained people, for lawyers, for families, even for staff. But it also enables corruption and an out of sight, out of mind culture To give one example of this, this year, the Department of Investigation published a report that they discovered almost $1 million worth of unused equipment stashed in some hidden lounge in a closed jail on Rikers Island. So just like, really emblematic of the type of corruption that scale and that type of isolation creates when you as a space for incarceration. The physical conditions on Rikers are horrendous, as Edwin also mentioned. Part of the issue is that the buildings sit on decomposing landfill, so the foundations are constantly shifting and causing leaks and issues with plumbing. So it's not even something that any amount of repairs can keep up with. Rikers is also killing our neighbors. Horrifically, 29 people have died in Rikers since 2022, since the current mayoral administration took office. And judges should not be sending people to a place that cannot guarantee their safety. People should not be in the city's custody when they cannot be kept well and safe. So we want to, the information about who is at Rikers further underscores why we need to close it and what the pathways are to reducing incarceration. So there are about 6,000 people at Rikers right now. You can see the racial disparities are extreme. So even though Black New Yorkers are about 25% of the population of our city, they make up 61% of people incarcerated on Rikers Island. There is a surging number of people with diagnosed serious mental illness in the jail system. That number is up significantly since the beginning of 2022. And as we've mentioned, the majority of people are awaiting trial, and they're awaiting trial for very long periods of time, even more so if they have a mental health need. For people who, a large portion of people are awaiting trial, that the determining factor is their inability to pay their bail. And so if they had more wealth, they would not be detained there, which is, I think, an obvious miscarriage of justice. So just to summarize, Rikers enables mass incarceration through a biased criminal legal system. It is built to isolate, not rehabilitate, and it doesn't address the root causes of harm, while at the same time exacting enormous moral and financial costs across our city. So because of all of those reasons, the mayor and the city, former Mayor de Blasio and the city council voted in 2019 to approve a plan to close Rikers, and it has a few main elements. It commits the city to reducing the jail population to about 3,300 people and investing in alternatives. It involves closing all the 10 jails on Rikers and the Boat, which is a floating jail in the Bronx, by 2027. Commits the city to replacing the outdated jails that exist now in Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx with new facilities that are designed with human beings in mind. So people may or may not be aware that in addition to the 10 jails on Rikers, the city has these 4 other jails that also existed, have in some cases have existed for a long time, but are also in terrible condition, often don't meet minimum state standards. And in the case of the Bronx are similarly isolated in terms of the Boat. And we also won some initial commitments from the city around moving resources from this overspending on incarceration to the kinds of community resources that can prevent and reduce incarceration. So there were investments in things like mental health crisis teams, some investment in supportive housing, although there's much more to be done there, and we can elaborate on that. But that amount of money, $250 million, in the total scale of what New York City spends on incarceration is really a drop in the bucket. And so we also set up a commission on community reinvestment and the closure of Rikers that was legislated by the city council to establish a group of people to guide the community reinvestment of the money that we should be saving by closing Rikers. And our partners in the Littman Commission estimated that could be up to $1.8 billion per year by shifting to this smaller jail system. I do want to make sure people know that one important hurdle in this plan has been cleared, which is that the sites for the borough jails have been selected and approved. So those are, you can see the locations here in the Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. In most cases, those are adjacent to a courthouse, just replacing a outdated jail that was on the same site that is being demolished as part of this plan. And you can see a bit of a sketch of an idea for how these buildings would be designed differently to better facilitate freedom of movement for people inside and to better address the conditions and the services and resources that people need access to when they're incarcerated. just in terms of the status of these replacement jails, in all 4 sites, there's either demolition or site prep in progress. In Bronx and Queens, there are construction RFPs that have been issued, and the city should be announcing that they've selected firms to build these replacement jails any day now. And in Brooklyn, there is a firm that's been selected, but this sort of points to some of the challenges that we're encountering with implementation, is that the contract term that was named in that contract stretches into 2029. So that's 2 years beyond the legal deadline to close Rikers. So while these sites have been approved and the city has committed to this plan, this is in no way, shape, or form on cruise control. And there's a lot that we still need to do to get the city to deliver on this mandate. So there's some of the key next steps that we'll touch on further as we go, is the need to invest in community well-being and expand diversion opportunities. So when the city agreed to this plan to close Rikers and reduce the jail population, the agreement was that the city was taking a different approach to public safety. We have seen from this administration a lack of willingness to really follow through on that, to really meet the need for investment in supportive housing, for mental health treatment, for a range of things that we've identified that are key to reducing incarceration and to meeting people's needs in the community. We need the city to follow through on actually closing physical jails on Rikers. So while the number of people incarcerated at Rikers now is far too high and is higher than what the city has agreed to as part of this process, there is unused space on Rikers, because the highest jail population in the history, within New York City's history, was around 20,000 people. And so while we are working on further reducing the jail population, we want the city to use the space that it has efficiently and be able to reduce costs and perhaps improve services to people incarcerated on Rikers right now, if their staff are better able to deliver services in a smaller number of buildings. And we want them to speed up the construction process. As I mentioned, while they're moving forward on the borough-based jails, there are delays. And along with all of this, the accountability for the Department of Correction and transformation of how they operate the jails is essential. And it's in some ways a whole other topic, so I won't go too far into that. But I think that sets us up well to hear next from my colleague, Ben, at the Vera Institute. And that's the next slide you'll see from me. Sorry about that.
Thanks so much, Sarita. Okay, I'm also gonna share my screen. It's so nice to be with you all virtually today. I'm very grateful it's virtual. And Sarita, thank you as always for sharing your insight, and Edwin for sharing about your experience. So I want to zoom out for a second and think about how Rikers does or does not fit into a broader understanding of public safety, and one that's rooted in community and also in evidence in terms of what actually works, because we want to invest in solutions that actually work to keep us safe. And so to start off, I just want to sort of think out loud about what we mean when we mean safety. And I think a lot of people are so used to talking about safety as punishment, that we can punish our way to safety, that people need to face consequences, that people need to be put away. And that's the way to make sure that we feel safe walking down the street. And that's not necessarily true. So, when we talk about safety, often we think about accountability. We think about addressing crime survivors' needs. And punishment is not accountability, right? If you go through the criminal legal system, you're sort of incentivized to not say you did it, because then the case is open and shut, closed, you're guilty, you go to prison, right? People plead not guilty, even if they did something. There's not this encouragement to actually take accountability for your actions and make amends in a way that actually means something to the person who was harmed. And actually, most people who go through the criminal legal system, most victims of crime, say that they don't feel satisfied at the end of it, that the system didn't give them what they needed. People also talk about punishment as if it reduces crime, but actually there's a lot of research that shows, which I'll talk about later, that even one night in jail increases the instability that leads to crime. And in New York City, we spend over $11 billion on police. We spend over $2.5 billion on jails. And New Yorkers still don't feel safe. So clearly continuing to invest more and more and more in our current apparatus of law enforcement and punishment isn't bringing safety closer to us. punishment also isn't a long-term fix, right? Like 98% of people who go into jail or prison come back out and are released to their communities, and how we treat them in the meantime matters because they're going to become our neighbors once again. And so often in the rhetoric, we're told that we can have a system that delivers safety, but then there won't be justice, right? Safety means swift punishment. It means keeping people on Rikers Island, even though they're innocent until proven guilty. That's the only way to keep us safe. Or we can have justice, we can respect due process, but then we're going to have lawlessness in the streets. And actually, as New Yorkers, we know that we can do better than that. We can invest in solutions that bring safety and bring justice, that treat people fairly, and that also make us all feel comfortable, riding the subway, walking down the street. And so another way to think about that, the difference really between safety and punishment, is what causes crime in the first place. And we know that in a lot of cases, it's instability, it's a lack of resources, it's a lack of economic opportunity, a lack of education, and a lack of upward mobility. And so arresting someone, sending them to jail only to release them, they may have lost their job while they were incarcerated, they may have lost custody of their kids. They may have lost their home because they missed a paycheck. Then they're released and we somehow expect them to be on a different path. And again, research from Arnold Ventures, which is a sort of big criminal justice think tank, shows that even one night in pretrial detention increases that instability and makes it more likely, not less likely, that someone will be rearrested. And so even from our own self-interest, when we think about the cycle we want to interrupt, that cycle of instability, arrest, jail, release, sending someone to jail isn't addressing their underlying needs. It's not introducing greater stability, which we know is the best way to decrease crime. It's actually exacerbating what is creating crime in the first place. And so using jail as our go-to safety solution really doesn't make sense. And so what do we do if we're not just locking everyone up? What we should be doing instead is investing in preventing harm before it occurs instead of just reacting in the aftermath. So leaving that cycle behind and investing instead in housing, which we know is a big driver of stability, right? It's hard to get a job if you don't have a house. It's hard to go to school. It's hard to provide for your family. Education, mental health treatment, and substance use treatment. We know that people who can access treatment are less likely to cause harm when their needs are being met in that way. And then we also know that violence is kind of cyclical, right? So much of violence is people responding to violence. And so again, investing in jail isn't breaking those cycles of violence because usually it's one group against another group. And so taking one person out of the equation does nothing to interrupt those cycles of increasing violence. But investing in community violence intervention, other public health interventions, restorative justice, and survivor services as well, because we talk about people who cause harm and people who are harmed as if they're different. But if you spend any time talking to people who've been justice involved or read any of the literature, you know that the person who got shot today might have been the person who was pulling the trigger the day before, or vice versa, that people who are harmed are more likely to cause harm and vice versa. So addressing the needs of survivors is also reducing crime because it's addressing the needs of both populations, of people who are harmed and people who cause harm. And all of those are ways to leave the cycle behind. So I just want to focus on two of them. Justice involves supportive housing and summer youth employment. So these are two solutions that we know reduce crime. They do it way more efficiently than Rikers, and they do it way more effectively as well. So on the left, you can see justice involved supportive housing. So there was a pilot called frequent user system engagement, where it was basically taking people who were cycling in and out of the justice system and providing them with supportive housing and other wraparound services. And it reduced admissions to New York City jails by nearly 40%, admissions to shelters, which are very expensive, by 90%, and days in psychiatric facilities by 55%. All those are things that our taxpayer dollars are paying for. So actually providing housing for these people paid for itself, because then they were relying less on these very expensive services because their needs were proactively met and addressed. Sending someone to Rikers does not have that effect at all, right? It exacerbates mental illness. It exacerbates issues with physical health for a lot of the reasons Sarita was talking about. If you ask anyone if they would rather have supportive housing or spend time on Rikers Island? I think the answer will be pretty clear. Sorry. And from a budget perspective, it's also honestly a no-brainer. The other is summer youth employment. So when we talk about keeping kids out of trouble, making sure that that they have, access to activities and spending money, and all the things that we want for young people, access to opportunity. Summer youth employment, the entire summer youth employment program for New York City last year cost about $207 million, which is less than 10% of what we spend on our jails. And the research is also clear that it reduced the chance of these young people being arrested on felony charges by up to 23%, which is incredibly effective. There is a ton of research showing that, the knowledge that you'll face harsh consequences if you are arrested is not actually a deterrent for people. It doesn't make a difference for public safety, right? People aren't calculating in that way when they cause harm in some way. So we know that that sort of fear of being sent to jail isn't having the deterrent effect that some people think it is, but summer youth employment, those are astounding numbers there. And again, it is not only more effective, but it's also incredibly cost efficient. So as Sarita mentioned, sort of what we would expect to see from a budget perspective, given the impending closure of Rikers, is a shift away from this jail first public safety solution towards other proactive investments that keep our jail population down while improving public health and safety. And we're not seeing that. And I know it's trite to say, but budgets are moral documents. The mayor at 3 p.m. today will be releasing his preliminary budget. So that is our opportunity to see what this administration's values are. And then it sort of kicks off a whole budget process where it will really be a discussion about how do we spend our finite resources in a way that aligns with our values and our goals for New York City. And I can't speak to what's going to be at 3 p.m. We don't know yet, but certainly what we saw last year is that the budget for the Department of Correction, which runs the jails on Rikers Island, is $2.7 billion this year. In comparison, the entire Department of Health and Mental Hygiene budget is less than that, is $2.5 billion. So we spend a huge amount of money on our jails. We spend almost $500,000 per person per year on incarceration. And in contrast, it costs about $41,000 to provide a year of supportive housing and other sort of supportive services to a New Yorker. And so again, thinking about our morals, but also thinking about our budget, to spend so excessively on punishment and on jail, to send someone to a place like Rikers where they are isolated, where they face horrific treatment, where 29 people have died in the last 2 years, when it would be more cost effective to provide supportive housing to someone, it really calls into question how New York is spending its money and what our values are, not in terms of what we say, but what we do. And so I know Sarita and others will talk about a sort of call to action in terms of getting involved in this budget process. But it is important for city leaders to know that spending almost $500,000 per person per year on jail is unacceptable. It's not bringing safety closer to us. And it's just not the kind of city we want to be. And especially, speaking as a Jewish person myself, I belong to CBE in Brooklyn. For a religion that believes in sort of reckoning and redemption, and really that accountability, right? When you think about the high holidays every year and how we're encouraged to apologize and think about how we can move forward and do better, to focus exclusively on punishment. You can imagine what kind of dire religion it would be if our holidays focused exclusively on punishment instead of on rehabilitation and renewal. And it is shameful that we spend so much money just on punishment, and that's all it is. There's no rehabilitation, and there's no sort of meaningful reckoning, and that shouldn't be. So sort of bringing it back to Rikers Island, it is an opportunity for us to take common sense steps to make sure that our criminal justice system aligns with our values and is also following the evidence of what works. And so closing Rikers will first of all put an immediate stop to the human suffering on Rikers, which should not be done in our name. It also will free up money, right? If we're spending less money on jail, it means we have more money to spend on the community-based solutions like housing, like summer youth employment, like restorative justice, that we know keep us all safe by preventing harm before it happens instead of just reacting in the aftermath. And transitioning to the borough-based jails that Sarita was talking about is also an opportunity to improve conditions, right? Because we're not talking about right now having a city with no jails at all. We're talking about transitioning to a borough-based jail system. And so that implies that there will still be people incarcerated, and we owe it to them and to ourselves to make sure that the conditions for them are humane. Because again, people get released, and these are our future neighbors, and how we treat them while they're incarcerated matters. So that's all. And with that, I will pass to Mari Hinojosa, who will facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sarita, Ben, Edwin. That was so informative and such a wonderful overview. I'm not sure who wants to handle this first question, but I thought it might be helpful for people who may not be as familiar with the issue to understand the difference between a jail and a prison and why that distinction matters with respect to Rikers.
Yeah, so I'll just say a jail is primarily for people who are pre-trial. So they've been accused of something, but they haven't been found guilty. And a prison is post-conviction, so someone's sentenced to some time. There's something called a city sentence, where if people are sentenced to time of less than a year, they can be on Rikers. But for the most part, people on Rikers, the overwhelming majority, it's what, 88%, Sarita, are people who have not been found guilty yet. And so we're talking about people who should be treated as innocent until proven guilty, and yet are held in the abhorrent conditions on Rikers Island for, sometimes a year or several years while they're presumed innocent. And so that, no one should be in those kinds of conditions, but particularly when we're talking about people who are innocent and haven't sort of had their day in court yet, it is extra shameful that we are treating people that way.
I'm seeing a related question in the chat, which is why are some people who cannot afford bail incarcerated?
I can respond to that one. We have a very flawed criminal legal system. So what happens when someone is arrested? In some cases, a person will be arrested and they're issued a desk appearance ticket, which means like they're not taken into police custody. They're just told to come back at a certain date for their court date. But if they are taken into police custody, within 24 hours, they have to see a judge, and that's called an arraignment. And so at the arraignment, you have a defense attorney working with the person who's been accused and arrested. And you have the prosecutor or the assistant district attorney, and they make their case to the judge. And what often happens throughout New York City is that the prosecutors ask for money bail, and the judge has the ability to set that bail. So their bail reform was passed in New York State in 2019, and it limited the number of charges for which money bail could be requested or set by a judge, but it didn't eliminate it in all cases. And so it continues to be a measure by which judges keep people incarcerated. So there's in theory, judges should consider the person's ability to pay. In truth, they rarely do. And so you see bails that are just sort of like if you're sitting in an arraignment process, which would be, it's horrifying, but also like a really important, I think, educational experience to have at some point in your life. You'll see a prosecutor sort of say like, we're requesting, and the whole encounter takes about 5 minutes. We're requesting $45,000 bail. And then the judge will say, and the defense attorney says, my client is indigent. They can't afford anything. They're living in a shelter right now. And the judge says, okay, 15,000. So they just sort of like cut it down from what the prosecutor requested, but it's not related to what the person could afford to pay. And so in many, many cases, you see people, there is data that shows like after bail is set, how long do people stay in custody? And anything beyond 7 days, you have to assume it's because the person can't afford it. Like if you could afford to pay that bail, you would pay it and you would leave Rikers Island. So there are other solutions when, judges could release people on their own recognizance, meaning there's no conditions, but you're just they tell you to come back to court at a certain date, and it can be determined. You can have an actual trial where it's actually determined if you did the thing that you're accused of. But for people who have a higher level of risk in some way, shape, or form, maybe they've already been arrested, or they have a mental health need that isn't met, and there's a concern that they may not make it back to court if that's not addressed. There are programs like supervised release and even a more intense case management version that the city is starting to pilot right now in Manhattan and Queens, and that should be a tool that judges utilize to release more people. So I hope I answered that as best I could, because at the base level, it's like, yeah, I want to know why too. It's unacceptable, but I hope that gave a little.
Well, there was another question in the chat that is also on this topic, which is the time awaiting trial in jails this long in jails other than Rikers, or is Rikers an unusually long pretrial stay? And then another question early on in the chat, someone wanted to know if you have any statistics on how many of the 88% who are awaiting trial are eventually found guilty.
Ben may have some of the stats on that second piece, but on the question that now I lost track of the first question you asked, which was about
the time spent
time
in Rikers longer than in other jails?
Rikers is very much an outlier. And that is a combination of the dysfunction of the Department of Correction and their failure to get people to their court dates, and facility, which is obviously worsened by the isolation of Rikers. It's also a function of the New York City criminal court system, which has just sort of a really unacceptable tolerance for dragging people's cases out and leaving people, languishing on Rikers. So the average time in custody in New York City, I think, is about 4 times higher than the national average. So there is a significant difference. I know that there is a substantial portion of people who are at Rikers who are ultimately not found guilty. Just to give an anecdote, one of our members spent 4 years on Rikers and was eventually cleared of the charges against him. And that is not an isolated example. There are many people who spend extended periods of time and then are ultimately not convicted. But Ben may have the stats on that.
And I would just add to that, are there any statistics on how many people plead just to get out of Rikers?
Yeah, I don't have the statistics to hand. I'm sorry. We have a whole research team, and I will ask them what they can get me. But we know how common it is that people strike a plea deal because they don't want to spend time on Rikers. The only thing I'll add about bail is also a lot of people think that it's, if you're dangerous, bail is set. And the purpose of bail in New York State is to make sure that you show up to court again, and that's it. And so when people talk about sort of, well, bail was set, but they were dangerous, 2 things. First of all, statutorily, that's not what bail is. Bail is a commitment mechanism to make sure you show up to court. And second of all, if we're using bail as a public safety tool, then we're only using it for poor people. Because if you have access to wealth, then you can pay bail and then you're back out on the street the same day and the next day very quickly. So it's only for people who don't have access to wealth themselves, their families, their social networks, who suffer because bail is unaffordable. And so at least in my mind, whenever I read about or hear about people saying, people sort of weaponizing bail as well, people are dangerous. The thing to remember, right, is bail does not apply to everyone equally, because if you have someone who can bail you out, then bail has no effect on you. So it's really just catching the most vulnerable people who can least afford to, miss work and not pick their kids up from school. And then they miss a rent payment. And then, they were already precarious financially, which is why they couldn't afford bail in the first place. And now they're even worse off. And then we release them and somehow expect it to be a different story when we've created the very conditions that we want to avoid in the first place.
We're running out of time here, but I wanted to put in 2 questions that have come in. One is just, can you give us a sense of what the day-to-day is like at Rikers? Is there any programming? What are the levels of violence like? I know that's a long question, but if you give us a little snippet. And then this will be a segue into Sarita's next portion, which would be, what can we do about this? And a call to action. Someone asked, are there any places that are doing this well? Are there any other states or municipalities that are doing this in an exemplary way. So day to day, and who's doing it right?
Sarita, you're on mute.
Thank you. I was saying I could touch on the day-to-day and let Ben talk about other states. I can tell you what we're hearing from our several of our members have loved ones who are in Rikers right now. And largely they are not receiving any programming. People actually in May, the mayor made a decision to, rather than cut various from the incredibly overstaffed rather than address the incredible overstaffing within the Department of Correction, which is they have 4 times more staff per incarcerated person than the national average. He chose to cut money from the corrections budget by eliminating programs operated by outside contractors, who also, in addition to operating important programs, were people coming into the jails from the outside, who people are desperate to see, and who bring a different level of sort of accountability, and some outside oversight. So there's been less programs since that decision was made last year, although they were always sort of slim. And even if their programs were operating, sometimes officers wouldn't take people to them. People are having a lot of trouble accessing medical care. And just this week, last week, the Board of Correction held an entire hearing, and is very much consistent with what we've been hearing from our members, that people don't even have the ability to wash their clothes, and the department doesn't consistently provide laundry service for them. So just like at a very basic level, people's needs are not being met. And when you think about how there are incredibly high levels of violence at Rikers, but the question is like, where does that come from? And just imagine the state of mind that people are in when you cannot get any of your basic needs met, and people are so frustrated, and they're languishing in jail because they can't afford their bail, and in many cases have not even done the thing that they're accused of. And just like the level of frustration that builds, addressing those basic needs for people would probably go much further towards addressing violence than what the department proposes to do, like use different like draconian forms of punishment. So I think that's I hope that gives some insight into what we're hearing from our members and their family members, and I'll let Ben touch on the next.
Then you have 1 minute.
Okay, I'll be really quick. So in terms of the sort of front door to the whole system, which is obviously policing and arrest, a great example comes from the West Coast, and it's the Cahoots model in Eugene, Oregon, where it's trained mental health providers who go to people in crisis and work to stabilize them instead of sort of sweeping them up into the criminal legal system. We know that Rikers is the #1 provider, supposedly, if people actually have access, of mental health services in New York City. That should not be, right? Incarceration is not the appropriate place to get your mental health needs met. And certainly on Rikers, the opposite is happening. But that Cahoots model, for example, is diverting people from this front door of incarceration, and instead helping them meet their needs. It's often, the social workers are sometimes peers as well. So they've been in their shoes, they understand sort of what they're going through, and they can help them work through it. Thinking beyond the US, we know that if you look at incarceration rates internationally, the safest countries, the safest communities are not the ones with the highest jail populations. They're the ones with broad social safety nets that guarantee people housing, that make sure that people have access to education and well-paid jobs. And so, we know that the US ranks really badly for our incarceration rate, and we are not the safest country in the world. We cannot incarcerate our way to safety. And, looking around the world, looking at Scandinavia, looking at a lot of Europe in particular, we can see that lower jail populations does not mean that there's chaos in the streets. It actually just means that people's needs are being met before they're put behind bars. Because once that happens, it's hard to get people back on the right path, because we're isolating people, we're punishing them before the fact, we're denying them the services that they need in the first place. And I think, as soon as you think about that cycle again, you see how self-defeating this is, spending $2.7 billion supposedly on safety when all we're really doing is traumatizing our future neighbors. It is not bringing safety any closer.
So Sarita, what can we do? We want to close Rikers. What would the next steps be?
Thank you so much. I am going to pull up my slides one more time so that I can give you a little bit of visual to follow along as I share. So one is that we really need the mayor to continue to hear that this is important to people. the mayor has expressed skepticism that reducing incarceration and closing Rikers is in fact the right path. I think for all the reasons that we shared with you today, we know it certainly is. So there's a link that we have here on the screen that is just a way to send a quick message to him. It sends an email to him, really reinforcing the need to close Rikers Island and expressing your support for it. We also would love to have as many people as possible, and we know that Central Synagogue is committed to organizing internally to do this as well, to engage in the city budget process. So this is a key step towards closing Rikers because New York City cannot continue spending the same amount of money that it has on incarceration, overspending on incarceration, and underspending on social services, and somehow get to implementation of the Close Rikers plan. Like there needs to be a shifting of resources. And so this mayor is going to be releasing his budget proposal this afternoon. And as we have in the past years, and then we've had some successes through this process, we need to engage really actively in pushing for shifting those resources for where they are, from where they are over present in the Department of Correction, to where there's a need and where there's gaps. Ben talked about supportive housing as a key, and that's one of the areas that we sort of organize with our partners around. And just to touch on that question about who else is doing this well. So New York City started this Fuse pilot around the justice involved supportive housing with 120 beds, and other cities saw that it was so successful that they modeled it. So now Denver has 250 of these justice involved supportive housing beds, a city the size of Denver. But New York City, at our size, still only has 120. So sometimes we have the solutions, we just haven't scaled them up. We just haven't invested in them like we really want them to work, or like we want them to actually meet the full need. So through that budget process, some of the things that we contact people about is submitting testimony to the city council through their budget hearing process, which happens in March and then again in May. So there's sort of a preliminary phase and then a follow-up phase, and contacting your representatives. So we'll create a tool where people can reach out directly to their city council members and say, this is a priority for me. These budget allocations are a clear pathway to closing Rikers. And then we share events, through Central Synagogue and the New York Jewish Coalition on Criminal Justice Reform are on our partner list, and we'll receive these updates that they can share with your networks. If you'd like to, gather more information about our campaign yourselves, you can also visit that our website, and I'll drop a few links in the chat for some upcoming things, and even that take action tool, just so you have it easily available. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Edwin Santana, a community organizer at Freedom Agenda and a case management specialist at Prisoner Reentry Institute at John Jay College, and to Sarita Daftary, the co-director of Freedom Agenda, and to Benjamin Heller, the senior program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice, for their calls to action today. As long as the jails at Rikers Island exist, New York City cannot be the safe, just, and humane city we want for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. Closing Rikers, as we've heard today, is both a legal and a moral mandate. The plan in place to do it was hard-won through years of advocacy and community engagement, and we need your participation now with Central Synagogue and with the New York Coalition for Criminal Justice Reform, the New York Jewish Coalition for Criminal Justice Reform, to support that Close Rikers plan and to give us more momentum to move it forward. It was already a decade ago that Preet Bharara, then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan, described a decades-long culture of violence at Rikers. 6 months ago, an independent monitor found that violence continues to run rampant on Rikers Island, including an extraordinarily high number of stabbings, assaults, and deaths. And these incidents, the monitor reported, are not typical, not expected, and not normal. And this is violence that affects corrections officers, incarcerated people, and future victims of crime. We need to remind our elected leaders that they can't continue to ignore the horror of Rikers. We need to remind them that they can't continue to kick the can down the road for someone else to handle. We need to remind them that we, their constituents, are watching, and we will continue to watch until they wash out this moral stain on our city. We can't lose heart and decide that the government will take care of this on its own. Our own experience as Central community advocates and New York Jewish Coalition advocates has shown us that our elected leaders rarely take action without hearing from us, their constituents. If we ignore this moral stain on our city, elected leaders will continue to ignore it too. You'll see in the chat and a follow-up email from us an opportunity for you to call on Mayor Adams to take action. He's spoken out about Rikers, but kind of dithered. Let him know that we're looking to him to show leadership and take steps to close the Rikers complex. We'll also ask you in a follow-up email to sign up with Central and the New York Jewish Coalition if you'd be interested in joining us and other congregants to support the Close Rikers campaign in the next few months. Freedom Agenda will be letting us know how we all can help the campaign as a Reformed Jewish and broader Jewish community. Maybe it'll be a Zoom meeting with your city council member and other constituents, or signing a joint message to Mayor Adams, or attending a service at Rikers. Whatever it is, you can help save others in our city and save ourselves as well. In the immortal words of Rabbi Hillel, if I'm not for me, who will be for me? And when I am for myself alone, when am I? And if not now, then when? Thank you for joining us today and for continuing to join us in future. And let's turn to Rabbi Hilly Haber to close us out.
Amy, thank you so much. That was beautiful, beautiful call to action. I want to just once again quickly thank our speakers today for sharing your time and your expertise with us. Edwin, Sarita, and Ben, thank you so much for joining us, for calling us to action. Amy and Mari, thank you for lending your voices, for guiding us and helping us create this program. Emily Bogdan for sending out our emails, for communicating, coordinating everything. And I also would just invite everyone here right now, if you just take a second, I would love to know what you're taking away from this conversation today. What are the things that are stuck in your mind right now? What are the questions or the thoughts? What are you thinking about? Just maybe take a minute to put them in the chat. And something that I'm taking with me today is really just how much Rikers Island, this is really not just a criminal justice issue, but these are overlapping issues of a crisis in housing, affordable housing, supportive housing in our city. This is a mental health crisis. This is a public health crisis. And we're dealing with these levels of violence where no one is safer there. And I want to call attention to a comment that Eric Waters made in the chat right at the top of the program, where he said, talk to anyone from any era who experienced Rikers Island. They will tell you that it was violent, that there was not an era where violence did not reign supreme from both sides, guards and people in prison. And Eric is someone that you can come and meet. He's on the leadership team of the Coming Home program. And I want to close by really inviting you to join us at Central. This is an issue that we can make an impact on, and this is something that you can get directly involved with. Wednesday nights, we have our Coming Home program. There's community dinners at 6 p.m. This is a reentry program that's run by Eric and his colleagues on the leadership team. Please join us any Wednesday night. Email Emily Bogdan at sensen.org to reserve a spot for dinner. You can come see the Reentry Theater of Harlem that's based at Central and support their performances. And you can also join us on a visit to Rikers Island. You can come with us to meet Jewish community members there, to share fellowship. And really, there's so few programs there that our visits do make a difference, and it's opportunity for learning and conversation. And the Jewish Coalition has made a commitment to making sure that Jewish community members are in facilities, and we're there, and we're building bridges between people who are inside and people who are in the city. Making connections with our neighbors. So I'm just so grateful that we're able to host this today. And I thank you all so much for being here, for listening, and for joining us in this movement to close Rikers and to make New York City a more just and safe place for every New Yorker. Thank you all.